Jeuel, I really got to know several years ago when I was working on the book A Necessary War. And this is the book. It's Memories of World War II from Anderson County Residents. And here she is on the cover. And she actually came up with the name for the book because I asked her, was World War II a good war? And she said, well, there are no good wars, but it was a necessary war. And that was what gave us the book. But today we're here to talk about the Code Girls. It's a wonderful new book by Liza Mundy, who was a reporter with the Washington Post, and it goes into the whole story of the 10,000 women who worked for the Army and the Navy in Washington, D.C., mostly during World War II as code breakers. Their technical name is cryptanalysts, and I have such a hard time saying that, I'm just going to call them code breakers. But even before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, February 7th, 1941, the Navy had begun shoring up its intelligence operation in Washington, realizing it was woefully unprepared for any kind of conflict, and it went out recruiting code breakers in the elite women's colleges of the Northeast. Wellesley, Williams, the Seven Sisters. And after Pearl Harbor and in the years that followed, the Army started shoring up its intelligence operation. And the Army and the Navy were such competitors, you sometimes wonder who we were really fighting in World War II, the Axis powers or each other. But the Army also tried to go to the Seven Sisters to recruit, and the Navy said, that's our territory. So the Army went down to teachers' colleges in the South and the Midwest. And that's how they found women like, who was then Jewel Bannister, now Jeuel Esmacher. It went through college in South Carolina. The Army Air Corps Air Cadets took over one of the dormitories, and Jewel will tell you about how exciting that was. But then they started offering classes in code breaking to any student who wanted to take them, and Jewel did that. What they were doing was they were flushing out people who might be good code breakers to work for them. And they also looked at women who were good in science, good in math, languages, and music. And that's how they wound up recruiting Jeuel Esmacher. They also wanted women of character and loyalty and grit, and women who could keep their mouths shut about what they were doing. And Jewel will tell you about the scary secrecy oaths they had to sign. So anyway, for quite some time, the story of the Code Girls was classified. In fact, I know of one woman who worked for the Navy who never told anyone, including her husband, what she had done during the war, and he found out after she died. But now the story is out, and we can sing the praises of these heroines of World War II. So we're going to start with our own Code Girl, Jeuel Esmacher, and we're just going to do kind of a 20 questions. So, you grew up in Star when it was a bustling little town.
Oh, I did, and no one would believe it now. That Star now, which has a Sunday call and 2 churches and a great house. And that's about it. But back then, we had 3 general stores. We had a bank, we had a post office, we had a drugstore with a pharmacist, a mill that did all of our cotton ginning. And it was a thriving little community. And of course, with the 4 lanes going the other direction, and just cut them off, but it's still home.
Well, apparently you were quite an energetic young girl. What unusual gift did you receive one year for Christmas? From your parents?
You won't even believe this. I got a pair of boxing gloves. I was so full of energy. My parents were doing everything they could think of to let me get rid of all this energy. So after he built me also a little gym so that I could do chin-ups and all that sort of thing. And then later he built us a regulation-sized tennis court. And that I lived on. It was a wonderful way for me to express myself and get minus my energy.
Now, when did you decide to pursue higher education in music?
I guess I'd always done that because my mother and dad started talking about college earlier than I can even remember. It was no question that we would go to college. And of course I started, my mother was a piano teacher. And I don't remember ever learning notes or time. I just always knew it. I'm sure she taught me when I was quite young. But I loved it, and that's the only thing I consider it all when I went to college was music.
Okay, so why Winthrop?
Well, that's another tie-in with my family. My mother and 4 of her sisters went to Winthrop, so I didn't have a choice. I went to Winthrop, and it was a wonderful college. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and recently went back to my 70th college reunion.
So Winthrop was the sister college of Clemson,
Right.
and it was where the girls went and where they became teachers mostly. It's a
That's right.
teachers' college. Okay. What do you remember about Pearl Harbor? Because you were in college then?
I was in Pearl Harbor. Let's see, I have to stop to think where I was. No, that was in
41.
41.
Were you still in high school?
No, I was in college. I was a sophomore. And when that happened, had gone home with my roommate for the weekend. This was on a Sunday. And the announcement came over on the radio, and her brother was there, who was already enlisted in the Army. And as soon as he heard that, and he got calls and messages that he was to report back to Columbia immediately, which he did. So it was a scary time, not knowing what really had happened and how much injury it had done to all of our forces. But time marches on.
Well, at Winthrop, the war began, and you and the other girls had a dance band. So you
Yes.
had rationing. How did you manage to get to your different gigs?
With great ingenuity. We played for all the college dances and the local USOs and that sort of thing, but we were invited to play for fraternity dance at the University of Georgia. Well, there's no way for us to get there because gas was rationed. When you used up your stamps, you stayed home. But we decided that we would all write our parents and say, can you spare any stamps? We got enough. And our wonderful band director, he was a special man. You wouldn't believe what he did for us. He had a regular car, so about 5 or 6 could sit in his car. He hooked an old trailer onto that car, and the roof was peaked. Up in the peak was where our bass fiddle was. and he had benches so that we could sit on those benches, and that's where we went to Georgia. Had a wonderful trip, enjoyed every bit of it, and thanked our parents for the gas coupons.
What did you play?
I played the trumpet in the concert orchestra and saxophone in the dance orchestra.
How about that? Okay, so also while you were at Winthrop, the Army Air Forces took over part of the campus, correct? What was that like?
Well, we had heard rumors that something was going on, but we didn't know because they moved so many of the regular students out of one dormitory completely, just emptied it, so we knew something was in the wind. And it was just dusk when we heard this. We knew that something was happening. And when they marched in, now this was all girls college. When they marched in, our little heart had a bit of panic. Thrilled to death. But it was quite an experience for them and for us. We still had house mothers in the dormitories. So, you couldn't get away with very much.
So not only did you have these men on the campus, but the Army offered courses for you to take.
They did. They offered a number of them, particularly in math, physics, astronomy, and, of course, crypto.
Yeah.
I took two of them. I took navigational astronomy, thinking I might go for a pilot's license when I got out of school. I didn't, but I thought about it. And cryptology, of course, I took both of those two.
Yeah.
The crypt and also the navigational astronomy.
So you were just 19 when you graduated, is that right? Because you graduated from high school at 16 then, and you blew through in 3 years? And you got a job as a band director at a high school in Kings Mountain. Do you think, was that unusual for a woman to get that job then?
Very.
Do you think it was because the men were all fighting the war?
I don't know.
You might have just been the best one.
No, maybe somebody hadn't had the idea yet. But I was, and I enjoyed it. I thought I was going to just a small school, no big problem at all. And when I got there, the first band practice I had 65 youngsters in that band. Now, they didn't know I was 19. And I sure didn't tell them. Because then they had put on the 12th year. So the seniors there in college were close to my age. But it was an interesting time. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. But I did know the war was on. I knew all the rationing was on. We couldn't buy butter, meat, oil. We were lucky to get fruits unless you grew them in your yard. And of course gas, oil. It was, so many things were made. Just rations, so you couldn't get them. You got stamps the first of each month. If you had a family of 4, for instance, you had X number of stamps. We got a little more in my household because my father was a rural mail carrier. And he had a route every day that he drove, so he got a few extra. That's the reason I thought maybe I could sneak a few. But it was a tough time, an enjoyable time, and I had a good time with my band.
Well, the year after you graduated, in 1944, you got a letter from Uncle Sam. And what did it say?
Well, basically it said, you've studied all your college courses, which we reviewed, and we could use you in Washington. And back then, everybody was patriotic. I mean, you wanted to do everything you could to get this war in the right direction. So I finished out the school year and went to Washington. My college roommate was there, so I at least had someone that I knew. But I had never been, I'm not sure I'd ever even been to Atlanta. I mean, I was a country girl and loved it. But Washington was a real wonderful, exciting time, not knowing what all was going to happen after I got there.
In Washington had just exploded, all the people coming in. You were a G girl, so just full of G girls, but you were based at Arlington Hall. So tell us about Arlington Hall.
Arlington Hall was really a junior college, I should say finishing school for the young ladies. It was a beautiful campus with ponds and golf courses and tennis courts, and the main building, by the way, is shown in the book. And I came down, well, first of all, you had to get through the main gate, which had 2 sets of barbed wire, ran up about 12 feet. And of course, you had the soldiers at the gates interviewing you and escorting you wherever you wanted to go and I was going for an appointment, so I got in. But this building was absolutely beautiful. It was a yellow brick with 6 huge columns going up, and I thought, wow, I really made it, not knowing that I was going to be working in some temporary buildings thrown up by the government. But that was all right. I was scared to death, but it was really an interesting place. All the generals and the higher-ups were in that building.
The pretty building.
The pretty building. The rest of us were struggling in 2 extra buildings. They probably were as long as I can see down, and then they had wings going off at least and they numbered them, A, B, C, D, etc. This was B building I was in, and I was in Hall 4. And we had an A building. Now, A building worked more with the machines, and they also had a locked vault in the basement. Mine was more the actual using codes, trying to break the codes. This was Army now, not the Navy.
Right. And she describes it in the book as the building was like a comb, like a long hall, and you were in one of the teeth.
That's right.
No air conditioning, no heat.
Well, very little.
Very little.
We had very little air conditioning, very little heat. But we learned you either wear clothes or you don't wear them. And you had no choice.
Yeah. Yeah, but I bet you had to wear stockings and all that.
Oh,
Well,
yes,
just
and
had girdles and
no
all
slacks.
that stuff. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't go the girl route.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. You probably didn't need to. So there are really detailed explanations in Code Girls about the work being done. And having a totally non-mathematical brain, it completely went over me. But can you give us kind of a simple description of what your day-to-day work was like there?
Well, I wish I could give you a simple one. I'm not sure for so long. We didn't speak of this.
Yeah.
Even my roommate and I. Well, I should tell them how we lived, shouldn't I?
Yeah, tell us how you lived.
Well, I didn't have any place to stay when I got there, but my roommate was there from college. I thought, I'll stay with her. So I moved into their apartment. There were 4 girls, 1 bedroom, 1 bed. So how do you work that out? By doing on the shifts. If one would work, say, from 12 to 8, and the next one worked the day shift, 8 to 4, and by the time they got out of the bed, we were getting in it. And we could work our shifts like that so we could have a place to stay. There was no bedrooms. Absolutely, totally none. Packed. Everything was packed. Remember, the gas was rationing, so no one had cars. When I say no one, I mean none of the girls there. We all depended on the bus. Rainy weather, snowy weather, it doesn't matter. Get there. But it was a hard time, but it was an intriguing time. Now, these codes that came into us. We had about, I don't even know how many, must have been at least 50 of these huge towers, like our cell phone towers, except taller, out in a farm in the hills of Virginia. And they were picking up the Japanese messages. Then they came into us with ticker tape. And then that had to be printed out. And we had broken their code, but that didn't help too much. So much of their messages were garbled. You could get a word here and then this with nothing, and you'd get a word here. So you had to kind of use your imagination and give it a try. You do crossword puzzles. Do you ever put something in and say, I wonder if that's right? So it's the same type thing. When it finally got to my desk, it had been through several machines, and I got just a sheet of paper with letters on it, just random letters. And then we had what we called a slide that we had put words on like ship, arrival, ports, guns, food, that type of thing. We had those names on this thing. And we would call this the slide rule. We would slide this along, hoping that we would get a hit. And if we would get a hit of ship, well, then we could kind of go from there and see if we could find something that says arrival or date, when if they're going to leave this port or not. So it's just it's a struggle. And once you get something really good, though, you can get excited. Otherwise, you just work.
They said, I think Liza Mundy said it was just incredibly boring, except when it wasn't.
And sometimes it was such intricate work that sometimes I would just have to put it aside and walk outside and take a walk, just to clear the cobwebs and come back and start over. It was a difficult time.
Well, you know of at least one noteworthy success you had.
I'll never forget it.
Yeah, tell us about that.
I was doing this message, and all of a sudden I saw ship, which is Maru, M-A-R-U. And I looked at that and I thought, wow. And I kept sliding and hunting, in other words, and I found that this ship was leaving this port on this date. And as soon as I got that information, I took it what we call up to the big boys, up to the top layer. And I knew the name of the ship, and in about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, that ship was sunk. And of course I was thrilled. Perhaps we'd saved some of our soldiers' lives. As I have gotten older, I look back on it and have a little change of feeling for the simple reason all of those Japanese soldiers and sailors went down in that ship. And they had mothers and sisters and girlfriends too, so it changes your feeling a little bit, but I'm still thankful that I could do it.
You mentioned briefly the secrecy of your work. Tell us, that's one of the really fascinating things.
It was so secret. The first day that I went in to sign all the applications, and incidentally, I couldn't even be hired until I got a birth certificate. So I wrote home to Mom and Dad. Couldn't call. I didn't have any money. So I wrote home to them and said, I need a birth certificate. And my dad called me and he said, you don't have a birth certificate. I said, you mean I wasn't born? But back then, I guess my mother delivered me at home. So it was, I guess, no records. So he had to take these affidavits through well-known people in Star. They have them swear that I was born. They were my parents, and I had been to Winthrop, all of this information before they would even let me sign up. Then they gave me the secrecy oath. Now that's one I never knew it to be broken, because when you sign that oath, they told you in just short order that if they ever heard that you had made any mention of where you worked or what you did, you would be prosecuted with $10,000 fine, which would probably be like $150 now, or 10 years in jail. Now you just signed it and you knew that was going to take place. Did find that they were putting, I call them spies, but they were spies, but they were service people. They were putting them on board these buses. They would come to the front gate and all of us, would be getting packed on these buses. But they were mingled in to see if conversations were going on that shouldn't be. So you just did not discuss anything. So I was always asked when somebody would meet, well, where do you work? I just said, I work for the government. And they said, well, what do you do? And then I thought, well, this is an awfully big building I work in, and it takes me all day to empty those trash bags. And a lot of things you had to work out. If a couple of us girls, 3, would go downtown maybe to a movie, or sometimes stop and get a Coke, invariably, you can just bet there were going to be soldiers who pull their chairs up to your table, uninvited. And then they would get inquisitive. Well, if they got to the point you could tell that this particular person was really being pushed, then one of us would have a coughing fit. We would die. And we'd just cough and cough, and then the girls would say, well, let's take you to the ladies' room. You need some water. And of course, we went to the ladies' room and we disappeared. But you did have a lot of things that you had to work out. Some of the girls had, was it Tom Collins, I think she mentioned, that they would, if they ordered a Tom Collins, that was a message. Let's get out of here. So, you had to have your own little secrets. Now, we didn't even discuss our work in our apartment. You don't know if you got, of course, then you start dreaming of all these things. Do they have things you pick up your messages in our homes? Or are the walls so thin that on the other side people are listening? So we just didn't. Just don't talk about it. I never did tell my parents what I did until some of this was released.
Oh, my.
I couldn't. I didn't want to go to jail.
Or pay $10,000.
No, either one.
Well, you were working at Arlington Hall on April 12th, 1945, when President Roosevelt died.
Oh, my goodness.
What was that day like?
That was a very, very sad day because we just felt he had led our troops in such a good way and he'd gotten us kind of on the winning side. So my sister was there visiting me that weekend. All of us just cried. And I guess I'll go one bit further and say our vice president was Harry Truman. And we didn't have any great hopes for Harry Truman. But I must say, he got in and did a terrific job and finally brought the water thing in.
Did you go down and watch the funeral procession?
Oh, I did. I went really down there twice. Once I went on the bus and lined up and saw this. It is just touching, you know, you just can't keep the tears back. It's just really a very touching moment when you see this. President Truman did a good job for us. The second time I went down was a happy time. I rode my bike down to Memorial Bridge. Any of you who have been in Washington probably know Memorial Bridge, because General Eisenhower was coming in from the airport and was going to turn down across the bridge. And I went down and parked my bicycle and stood there and waited for him. And he came in on a Jeep, standing up with his little Eisen jacket on and waving to everybody. And I just, I just felt so happy.
Had that grin.
Yes.
Well, President Roosevelt died and Germany surrendered shortly after that. But all through the summer of 1945, your code work was continuing.
Oh, yes.
And then in August, the atomic bombs were dropped. What was the reaction to that?
Everybody was shocked. I mean, just like the public. You was shocked when you heard that. And you really didn't know what it was. But never heard the word atomic bomb. And because you must remember that we did not have televisions and cell phones and all computers and all that sort of thing. So if you weren't listening to the radio, you weren't getting too much of the news. It was just a terrible time. Terrible and good, because we thought maybe that we wouldn't have to invade Japan, because we were on the verge of invading Japan.
And they were thinking that could cost hundreds of thousands of casualties.
It would have.
Yeah. So a few days after that was VJ Day.
Ooh, that was a happy day. The war was over, and we knew that it was over, those on the post, because they had let us know. But we wouldn't let us leave the post. It was sealed. No one could come in and no one could go out until the president announced that the war was over. And once he announced that the war was over, they opened the gates. Everybody went into Washington. Everybody. My roommate and I went, and it was mobbed shoulder to shoulder downtown. But have you seen, if you've ever been to Washington and looked down Pennsylvania Avenue, it's very, I don't even know how many lanes, 8 or 10 lanes. That was strong, arm in arm, walking down Pennsylvania and was singing, "Happy days are here again." It was, you see strange things. I looked at Statler Hotel as I passed, and people were throwing rolls of toilet tissue out. That was the streamers. We had streetcars back then. Hooked onto the electric there. The fellas were getting on top of those streetcars, unhooking them, and then they were just sitting all over the top of them. It was a wild place. But a good thing happened. My roommate and I ran into 4 service people that worked out where we did, and my roommate had dated one of them, and another one was my future husband. And don't let anyone ever tell you that there's no such thing as love at first sight. Yeah. That was it. It was just like that. So he had been sent to the University of California to study Japanese. and had come back as a Japanese translator. And it was just a time I can hardly explain. When someone asks you, what do you do? I couldn't even say it to him for fear someone would hear or tell somebody. So it was one of these hush-hush things. He was sent, no, that was the 14th of August. On the 17th of October, he was sent to California, thinking he was going to have to go over into occupation forces. But back then you had points for how many months you'd been in service, and he had enough points that he had a choice whether he was going to go over or he was going to come back, get out of the Army and come back home. He got out of the Army and came back home. Got back home March the 1st, and we were married May 25th. And we had 1 month short of 63 years together, so it worked.
So the real meaning of VJ Day is?
Victory for Jeuel.
Now, Jeuel, apparently the most able of the Code Girls were asked to stay on, and you were one of those.
Yeah, I did stay on.
And what did you do?
Well, everybody at that point was really concerned about Russia. When you look back, because hindsight's always good, if our generals had allowed different things to happen, we could have been in Berlin before the Russians. But they didn't. They held them in south and didn't let them move. So after the war, we were concerned about the Russians. They had already come over through Berlin and taken part of Germany. So we immediately started studying Russian. I neglected to say, I also had to do that when I first went in. We had 2 or 3 weeks, 8 hours a day, Japanese. And then when we started Russian, the same thing with Russian. Wouldn't you know, I've had both languages at not even hours. I mean, even the symbols aren't like. Even the alphabets are not like. So it's a learning experience for sure.
Yeah. And you remained there for several more years after the war?
Yes, I didn't resign there until 1950.
Okay.
So I was there quite a while.
Yeah. So she was. Well, it's a long time since all that happened.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about the work you did during the war and that time and the feelings of just being an American?
Well, I know that we did some good work. I know that we did save some lives, that we know. It was an experience. It was hard work and a very secretive time. And a very hard time because none of us had any money to speak of, no cars, no televisions, no food that we could just go buy. So it was a hard time to live, but a happy time in many ways. I guess my big regret comes to the present. I'm just sorry that we are not patriotic like we used to be. Everyone back then, there was no argument, it was just, you were an American. That's all that mattered, you were American. I wish we were that today. I wish there were no Democrats, no Republicans, just Americans.
I know that you were interviewed by the author of this book. Tell us about that interview. It must have been very interesting for you, and I found your name in the back of the book that you had been interviewed on such and such a date, so tell us about that.
I did get this telephone call from Liza Mundy. She lives in Arlington, Virginia. She wanted to come down and interview me because she was in the process of writing a book. And I was welcomed her and said, come on down. We chatted we had a lovely conversation. I must admit, though, much to my horror, that I had forgotten totally about that interview. Totally. And when Gene Mahaffey called and told me about this book, and Catherine too, and he said, your name's in it. I said, well, how the heck did they get that in there? Then I started really thinking back. Gee, she was in my home. I emailed her a note saying, I said, I hope you remember me, but, and well, she wrote back and she said, oh, I remember that interview very well. When I walked in your house, it smelled so good because you'd been cooking peanut brittle. So I knew, and I do that often, so I knew that it was the right one. This book, took untold hours. I can't tell you how many hours of research it did to write this book. She's gone way back from the beginning. All of these girls coming in, and Army and Navy kind of fighting over them, what districts they could go get girls that they could. It was a very intricate book, and some of it is not easy reading. But like Catherine said, she just skipped over that part. But it does go in depths of what happened. If any of you have a mathematical mind, you would enjoy that book tremendously.
And if you don't, just skip over the hard parts. Like any other questions? Hold on.
Jeuel, did you happen to know or have an opportunity to meet Agnes Meyer Driscoll? She was a civilian that worked for the Navy. And,
well, we didn't, Army and Navy didn't get together very often. For the simple reason, our location was out in Virginia. The naval location was down on Constitution Avenue in Washington. And they also had another one out further. They had taken over another girls' school for the Navy. So we didn't have any day-to-day communication at all.
Something from the book that the Navy was kind of snooty, they
oh boy, you know it.
Most of the women who came to work for the Navy joined the WWII, so they were in uniform, and you were a civilian, and most of the
yes.
Army girls were civilians.
Oh, we had no uniforms. Also, no slacks. Skirts, blouses, dresses.
Yeah. Other questions? Oh.
In Hidden Figures, and also in the article in the paper Sunday, it kind of mentioned discrimination because you were a woman and looked down on your skills. Did you encounter some of that?
Well, I guess I could say I encountered it, but it didn't bother me at all because I've always been pretty strong-headed. And those kind of things didn't bother me. I was never bothered by any of that. I never experienced it. Now, some of the girls did, especially those that were a little bit shy or meek and soft-spoken. They'd kind of get pushed down all directions, but I happen not to be one of those.
She had those boxing gloves, too. Were there women selected from any other Southern female college other than Winthrop?
I'm sure they were. I don't really know. Catherine, do you know that at all?
She talks about some of the different schools, but they were mostly in the South and the Midwest. So she kind of focused on a few, and Winthrop sent quite a few women. Almost all of their graduates in math during the war years went to work in Washington. It's really interesting. There's someone over here who had a question.
Hi, Jewel.
Can you speak up?
So, my dad fought in the war, and he was fighting in New Guinea. And in the book, it talks about the Code Girls breaking the code that told about 40,000 Japanese sailors that were on their way to New Guinea, Port Moresby, to fight the Americans. And the code was broken. The ships were sunk. And it's ironic that maybe you or your friends could have saved my dad's life.
Well, I appreciate that. I certainly hope we had some ends of making some good moves and trying to get words to fit on that page. That one in the back.
Oh, okay.
Was there ever any communication between the code breakers in England and the code breakers at the hall?
There well could have been. I am not aware of it. In England, that was, the Navy did much more work in England than we did, or throughout that area. Ours was strictly Japanese area.
You're talking about Bletchley Park. It was the Navy that interfaced with them, and there's quite a bit about that in the book. So if you've got questions, it'd be interesting for you to read. Okay.
Do you mind if I ask your age?
Not a bit.
What's your age?
I'll be 94 in February. Pardon?
You could pass for 83.
That's what comes with doing the cryptogram every day.
I do. One in the paper, it's the celebrity cipher, it's called. I do that every day, and the jumbled words I like to do. I don't like crossword puzzles. I don't know why I don't, but I don't. So I don't bother with that. But I do those every morning to get the cobwebs cleared out.
Jewel, what else do you do to stay vital? Because you're a very vital lady.
Well, I've never been one that I could just sit. Going way back to my parents, and they I volunteer at the church office a couple of days a month. I love to play the piano. I still do that a lot. I love to read. I just keep books going always, but only one. I'm one of those who, if you have one project, you finish that before you start the next one. Also, I love to crochet. I have crocheted all my life, and I have made, I don't know how many Afghans. Right now, I'm working on one I've just started. I just can't quit, you know. But
And that's the math again. It
probably.
really is, because
Probably.
needlework does that. Okay. Yeah.
You were decoding.
Right.
The coding in those days, was it done manually or by machines, or how was the encryption done?
Some of both, some of hand. We did have a lot of machines that, for instance, since we had broken the Japanese code, the machines had worked our alphabet instead of theirs, and which would coincide with that. So it went through a machine to do that. So we could get that far. Can you imagine what it would be now with computers? Wow, like that. But it went through both machines and individual work. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, let's take one more question.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you doing?
I'm well.
You're doing well, I know. My question is, after such an exciting life, what brought you back home?
Retirement. My husband was a banker, and even when we first got married, he got a job at a local bank, but he was drafted in his junior year at college. So he was going back to George Washington University to finish up his degree in business. And he stayed with that same bank until he retired. As he said, he went from lowly teller right up the line, and he did. I'm proud of him. When he retired, he was executive vice president of this bank with 43 branches. So he did good work. He was a good man.